welcome back. I am Aaron Sheehan, your host of the B2B Uncut podcast, sponsored by Oro Commerce. And I'm happy to be joined today by Jennifer Polce.
Polce.
Polce. See, I asked this question when we paired like 3 months ago, and I've completely forgotten. Polce, my
Yeah.
apologies. Jennifer is joining us from beautiful and very hot, it sounds like, Pittsburgh.
Yep.
But Jennifer is a world traveler, has been all over the place and worked in, I think, just about every continent except Antarctica, it sounds like at this point, and has a variety of experiences to share with us and all of you. So I'll stop talking and let Jennifer Polce introduce herself to you.
Great. Yeah. So I'm Jennifer Polce. I'm a with izba Consulting, and I've been in the consumer product space for almost 15 years, nearly entirely in supply chain and operations. So really my background is in helping fast growing brands operationalize and go to market. And then, like you said, most of my early career was overseas. So I was in Singapore and Australia, and then I relocated back to Pittsburgh 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago now.
Got it. And I was looking at your LinkedIn and you went to school in London. Is that right?
Yeah, so actually that was it was with the University of London, but it was an external program. So I did that while living in Singapore. Yeah, and then
Okay.
Australia after that. So
Okay.
I have been to Europe a number of times, a couple of times for work, but did not ever live in London.
It counts. It counts.
Yes,
I tell myself
exactly.
that when I go to London. Cool. So you said you're with izba Consulting. First off, can you spell that for all our
Yeah.
podcast listeners?
Sure, yeah, it's IZBA.
Got it. Okay. Fantastic. So what does izba do? What problems does it solve for brands?
Yeah, so ISBA, we're a supply chain and operations consulting firm. The companies that we really focus on are fast growing consumer brands. So we're helping them as they move through the life cycle of their business, really kind of operationalize what they're trying to do. And really what that looks like is, improving efficiency and reducing costs. And that can look like a lot of different things. So it might be finding the right product manufacturer, or when you're bringing in the goods into the U.S., what does that look like? What freight forwarders are you using? What strategy are you thinking about? Depending on what market you're in, what does your distribution look like? And then you're also getting your products to the customer. So whether that be D2C or B2B, there are different ways to do that. So we're helping them think about what's the most optimal way to do that, depending on their size and what their ambitions are.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think Temu and Shein and now Amazon are making de minimis really interesting to people. I think people are starting to learn about this term more than they were aware before. Um, some of Amazon's recent sort of product announcements are I'm sure interesting in your line of work. Um, so I'm curious. So this is the B2B Uncut podcast. So most of the people who listen to this are in distribution or manufacturing. Um, and so you've had a pretty wide variety of experiences. What were you doing before izba?
Yeah. So I was a couple of different things, but in for a long time I was working with a consumer electronics distributor in Australia. And so we supplied most of the major retailers there with various consumer electronic products. So we would manage brands and bring them into Australia. A lot of them they could be US based, but a lot of their manufacturing, especially at that time, was based out of China. Then we also started developing our own brands for those retailers as well. So whether that be like phone cases or wall chargers, different things. And so we'd help them manufacture and develop those products as well, as they started wanting to do that and kind of like cut out the massive brand margins that were required.
Got it. So you started off doing distribution and brand side and then moved into consulting at izba. But it sounds like supply chain has been kind of a continuous thread for you.
Yeah, that's
You've
right.
been dealing with procurement, you've been dealing with suppliers, you've been dealing with logistics and shipping optimization all this time. And it's interesting because people who listen to this podcast will know that I've had on, I think you're the fourth person who sort of self-identifies as being in the supply chain industry that I think I've interviewed in the last 5 months, I think. And it's always fascinating. It's very fascinating to me anyway to hear how everybody is in supply chain, which sounds like a thing, but every single person I've talked to has been coming at it from a different, totally different area, has a different background and expertise. You're all doing logistics, you're all optimizing warehouses at some level or operating inside of a TMS and trying to figure out how to deal with freight forwarding and everything that you just talked about, de minimis regulations. But the way you're all coming at it is very different. So I'm super curious. Don't give me, give the audience a cool. What's a cool story? Like I mean, you've been everywhere. Like you've seen kind of all sides of this. Give me a cool story or cool experience from maybe something that you did before ISBA that like something that you did or an experience that you had that you find yourself thinking about a lot in your day to day as a consultant.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. There's just a funny thing that comes to mind when we were launching a product. I was coming back from Hong Kong and we were air freighting some of the product over, which I always don't recommend doing, but sometimes you have to if you're running across tight timelines. Definitely, reduces your profitability on the product when you do that. But I happened to be on the same flight as like the cargo that was coming over with that. And so it was just funny. I was like, "Oh, I hand delivered this inventory to the warehouse," but that was just a funny, like,
Did you
kind of a funny
charge? Did you
thing.
get to charge a fee or bill
Right, right,
some
yeah,
like,
and, like, build the I was working
right,
maybe now I could, like, build the
white glove
hours for that
service?
time. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Very good service, but, besides that, something that comes to mind is, like, when before we moved our operations to, be outsourced, we had our own operations on site. And it was, it's quite different. Most of the clients that I work with now are using some type of 3PL or outsourced provider. And then being able to like see and touch and go to your operations on a daily basis, it has costs associated with it, but it really helped. And so I always think about that. And especially when I'm, speaking to my client today about how important it is to be in person when you can be. And also like go on site to, your providers and try to, improve the morale of whether that's your manufacturers or the 3PLs that you're using. So I always think about that because we were so hands-on and I was so hands-on in the business for so long. Like I was often out there, building pallets if we were low on staff or, when we were launching in different B2B channels, every single one of them has really specific routing guidelines. So you're going through that with the warehouse staff and, showing them what needs to be done. We were building out pallets for Costco. So we were like folding the actual requirements for those pallets. So I just remember like how hands-on things were in the beginning. And I think, it wasn't that long ago, but things have become more digital and easier as time progressed. And so I think that type of thing can kind of be lost and it can often make things more complicated the further away you are and removed from your supply chain and operations.
I think that's absolutely right. It's interesting, obviously, for us at Oro, for me as a e-commerce practitioner, we're usually living more on the technology side of things,
Right.
and so your focus tends to be on trying to operationalize and gain efficiencies, and then it's very growth oriented usually.
Hmm.
But there's stuff you've got to do if you successfully grow around like getting the pallets built, getting them out, getting the product to the right people in the right quantities with the right SKUs, the right barcodes, on time, and that's actually not solved by someone behind a keyboard most of the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think as well, sometimes you can like over engineer something depending on the stage of it as well. And like you expect this growth to come, and then maybe it doesn't necessarily do that, or it doesn't pan out exactly like you thought it was. So you end up over engineering something that is relatively simple.
That is a really good segue into my next question to you, which is going to be, well done. How does one go about setting up a supply chain? And I ask this because I have conversations sometimes with startups who they have an idea for a product and they've gotten some proofs of concept built.
Yeah.
And now maybe it's becoming successful, or to your point, they're projecting that it's going to be successful. What goes into a supply chain? Let's do a little 101 for the listeners. How do you do it?
Yeah. I have these conversations almost every day with different brands, whether it's like companies that we're already working with or new companies, but um we kind of go through what is the life cycle of a product as well. So the first thing is thinking about like where are you in the product life cycle currently? Is your product already developed? And so we want to know where is your manufacturer? Sometimes we're thinking about one of the things that a lot of people are thinking about is nearshoring, right? Because you're talking about de minimis, where our product's coming from with all the tariffs in China, as well. A lot of manufacturing are thinking about, like, how do I bring my product closer to make it, to think about, less bottlenecks, less constraints through that. So that's something that we're thinking about. Depending on your size, it varying things can make sense. After we get to past that stage, we want to think about, okay, now how do we get the product to the actual, place that you're bringing it to the customer, right? Are we going to be bringing it and warehousing it in the US? Or if you're manufacturing in China, do you want to set up a distribution center potentially in China or in Hong Kong and then ship directly from that particular location? I always think, even as a customer, sometimes I'll buy things and then I don't even realize, I'm like, oh, this product's actually coming from India, like something for clothing, right? Like it's coming directly. So they're bypassing that whole supply chain of putting it into a container and like bringing it all the way to the US. So there's pros and cons to that, as well. And then, we're thinking about, the last thing is really like distribution and where is your end customer. So is are your primary customers more so on the B2B side, or are they more so direct to consumer? And then depending on the answer to that is how we're thinking about setting up, where do your distribution centers need to be. Things like the size of your product also come into play, right?
Mm.
Because the larger your product, probably the closer you want to get it to the end customer. And you have to think about, it's different sending a piece of, I don't know, like a toothbrush versus, a couch, right? Like they're very, very different supply chains that we're setting up. So those are all kind of like the nuanced things that we think about and we probe into, as we're evaluating setting company supply chain up.
Got it. It makes total sense. So, if it's cool, I'd like to move through some of the kind of common models that we see
Mhm.
here at Oro. So, if I'm a and this will cover sort of all the different motions that we just talked about. But if I'm a fast moving consumer good brand, where you got your start, it sounds
Yeah.
like, and I'm selling direct to consumer, okay, that's pretty simple, right? Like, what like everything you just outlined
Mhm.
actually, I think, answers the question of what goes into direct to consumer, because that in the end point of that supply chain is the last mile delivery. And then the only thing you didn't really talk about was, let's say, for a US based audience, sort of the carrier landscape in there. But there's a part of D2C that gets overlooked a lot, and that is that last mile and then the returns.
Oh.
So I've always been kind of curious just about how that end of it works, because you don't see that in B2B very much, obviously.
Yeah. Um, so parcel is extremely interesting at the moment. I think that leading up until the last couple of years, and it's really driven by technology, UPS, USPS, DHL, FedEx, they've been the primary players in the parcel market, and that's who, everyone was using and, most people are still using. But because of the ability to rate shop and potentially utilize many different carriers, so, a lot in the regional carrier space, and then there's a lot of up and coming companies that are, taking advantage of zone skipping and offering more lucrative air rates as well. And so there's a lot of players in the market now. And if you can take advantage of a lot of them, it's actually really disrupting the amount of business that's going to the larger players, which in the end, allows you to potentially renegotiate. So it's about what makes sense for your size of products and, where your customers are located within the US as well. So you might want to think of having one central location. That's pretty common for a lot of the, smaller company, like smaller product types. Say you're in apparel, you have a lot of SKUs. And then, but if you're, larger in product size, maybe have less SKUs, you might want to think about a more distributed type of landscape where you have warehouses across the country so that you can reduce your parcel spend, because usually from a D2C landscape, it's the largest spend in like logistics and fulfillment is on the parcel side of things. So anything you can do to really like optimize and drive that cost down is really important. And that's where we spend a lot of our time with the D2C focused brands.
Got it. And when somebody wants to return something, what does the reverse logistics side of that look like?
Yeah, and I noticed that for returns specifically, it can vary quite a bit, right? From business to business, depending, right? So apparel, quite a high, yeah, returns percentage. And then I think especially in like apparel for women versus men, right? There's like a stark difference um
Very
in
much.
those percentages. And so there's a lot of different softwares out there that like will bolt into whatever your e-commerce platform is, say that be Shopify, and help manage that returns process because you want it to be easy, so you don't have to overburden your customer service team. Um, but then you also want to potentially take that opportunity to upsell to that customer, and then ideally it results in an exchange versus a flat out return.
Right.
And there's like a lot of things that you can do there. So there's some options, right? So there's things like happy returns, right, where you're
Mhm.
consolidating to a single point. You're taking advantage of like Amazon's kind of like drop offs and return distribution network. And I think that's one of the things that has been interesting is the consolidation of returns
Basically.
versus just putting a single label on it. And I think
Mhm.
customers, at least myself, like I like that flexibility to not have to find a UPS store, but just to go to a Staples, for example, and drop my product off. But again, there's a lot of different options, but I think one of the key things is like leveraging technology and then making it easy for your customer to make those choices and make it as kind of frictionless as you can.
Yep. No. Okay. So thank you. So that was very educational. So since it's the B2B Uncut podcast, I want to now start talking about wholesaling.
Yeah.
So I get everything you just said about the D2C supply chain, and especially the return provider consolidation. I'm seeing a lot of that now. Even in the last 6 months, there's been a tremendous amount of that. But if let's say I am a brand and I want to start wholesaling my products to a brand new market where I don't have a distribution network today.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking of the scenario where I'm a consumer brand, let's say, and I've decided to add a channel. I've decided that I need more, frankly, more breadth of revenue, more diversification of revenue, and I want to start building brand presence in places where I don't necessarily have a good effective way to sell direct to consumer without paying an enormous amount of acquisition cost.
Right.
So, I'm used to shipping individual parcels directly to my buyers. Maybe I'm using Amazon for that. Maybe I've got my own 3PLs that I'm working with. Now I'm doing wholesale. It's a totally different ball game. What do I need? Like, what do I need to think about for wholesaling that I'm not thinking about for direct to consumer?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I would say for a brand that's looking to get into wholesale is like, what is your distribution strategy for at the first and foremost look like? Because there's a lot of different options there, right? You could work with a local distributor. So depending on if you're going into even like another country or say like a particular market like grocery where it's quite common to use a distributor model, that could be an option. You could also be looking at like contracting with sales agents or hiring a sales team to manage the relationships with the retailers directly. So that's another option. So I think one of the things to be thinking about is one, distribution model. How are you thinking about that? And then that's going to in turn, make you realize how much of the logistics and supply chain you're actually responsible for because it varies model by model. Something else that you would want to think about is just around like legal and regulatory compliance. So, there's certain requirements about like what you're saying on packaging that isn't necessarily the same as it is from a D2C perspective. And then usually that's outlined like within the routing guidelines. Retailers will often have certain manufacturing compliance that you need to like meet and criteria that you want to live up to. So you want to make sure that you're compliant with that in advance of moving forward with them. And then from a logistics and supply chain perspective, which is kind of where I'm most familiar with and step in, and every single distributor, retailer, and a wholesaler, they have their own set of routing guidelines that you need to adhere to and follow to. And that's really to just make their receiving process as efficient as possible. So, pallet guidelines, labeling, just system setup. How are you going to be communicating with them, right? Usually it's via EDI. You want to make
Right.
that process as seamless as possible. And some way to like intake the orders as well, right? You don't want to take them in via email or something for every single one and have someone on your team like keying them into a system.
That's
Um,
super common,
yeah,
to be honest, and even for very large distributors, I have found that is I mean, this is why we have a business here at
yeah,
Oro to some extent, but, yeah, it is shocking how much volume still goes and it's kind of a game of telephone often because it'll go through multiple sets of human beings who are typing orders from one system into another off a piece of paper, from a telephone call, transcribing it. It's crazy.
yeah. And it's like, what do you have in stock? How many units were on this pallet? And like, there's just a lot of inefficiency and like things that can be lost in translation. So anything you can do to reduce that is really important. And then I think as well, like different from distribution strategy, but like marketing and sales strategy can be very different, right? Versus e-com, because just you might be thinking about, do I want an end cap or am I going to be in this catalog? And just the way you're thinking about marketing is different. And then from like a financial perspective, right, there's going to be different margins involved with wholesaling. Sometimes there's discounts that are required for early payment or chargebacks associated with not being compliant with the routing guidelines. So there's just a lot to, take into account as well from a financial perspective.
It's really interesting because, in the last, I think in the e-commerce world has had an interesting sort of arc in the last 5 years because obviously e-commerce was on a sort of slow, steady curve up in terms of adoption percentage of the total market, the total commerce, market. COVID happens, it shoots up because you can't go to the mall, you can't go to Walmart, you
Right.
can't go to Target. Et cetera. And so everybody jumps on and you see all of these direct to consumer online e-commerce brands launch and blow up and raise crazy money. Like, do you have an away bag? Because I feel like
Oh,
everybody
yeah,
like
I
had
do.
luggage from a right.
Of course I
We all
do.
went out and bought away luggage like in 2021,
Yeah.
even though we couldn't travel very much. Um, and then you see there's been an implosion in that market because there was honestly too many people too many straws into a glass that didn't have enough water in it, basically.
Yeah.
Um, and now what I have seen is all of these direct to consumer brands have done exactly the scenario that we just talked about, which is they have diversified their channels by realizing that no, you really actually do want to be inside of brick and mortar chains for
Hmm.
distribution. Like distribution is actually hard. Like it's cool to disintermediate, but you're paying crazy acquisition costs for those customers.
Right.
And now, okay, we're doing wholesale. And from the software industry side of it, it's actually not that hard. But everything you just described that goes into a brand deciding to go into wholesale from the routing requirements, which you keep mentioning, and they sound scary, I'll be honest. The legal and compliance piece of it, the distribution, how do I get the relationships? Because it's very relationship driven. How do
Mhm.
I stock? How do I get packages? How do I get pallets out instead of individual packages? All of that is very complicated. But from you mentioned Shopify earlier, from the Shopify view of things, it's super simple. You've already got a website. Okay, I made a
Yeah.
second website, and this website sells in quantities of 10 instead of quantities of 1, and I'm selling to boutiques. But it sounds more involved than the software people would have us believe.
Yeah. And I think that something else that's worthwhile to think about as well is like what you're actually offering on these channels as well, right? Like, do you want to have the exact same product mix that's on your D2C site as you are offering to the wholesalers? Something you mentioned like selling to particular boutiques. So maybe on your B2B site, you want something that's more of like a cash desk unit, right? And like something that is particular for B2B, so it's not necessarily cannibalizing your D2C sales, and you have like clear channel diversification. So I think that that's really important. I think it's definitely more complex, and it's really important to stay organized because every single channel requires there's like a different framework and way that you're going to work with each one. But something I've noticed a lot of companies do successfully is like there's the bigger, retailers that you're working with, and then you're also working with a lot of different wholesalers. So if you're able to bucket them into categories of like how you think about them, that's a really helpful kind of like tactical way to break things out. And like if it's a smaller retailer or wholesaler, to not try to make completely different price lists, right? For every single one, maybe just have categories so that it's replicable and scalable for your business as you expand in B2B.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the sales people listening to this probably just like winced a little bit because they love to create individual price lists for every
Right, right,
it's
right.
their competitive advantage. Um, no, I totally get that. And everything you said about sort of segmenting or bucketing your buyers into, to me, it's like who's gonna buy from me via EDI, who's gonna buy from me via my website, who's gonna buy from me via a phone call to a field rep, who's gonna buy from me and this is all B2B context, who's gonna buy from a hub, sort of go to a desk, a trade desk or something like that and buy. Um, all of those people have different needs because their businesses dictate how they come to you, and each one of them has different expectations around fulfillment, around how much they're gonna buy, how they're gonna pay you, maybe tax and regulatory. It gets complicated pretty
Yeah.
quickly.
How
Uh,
they're paying you is really important, right? It's the actual order to cash process. Sometimes I've been in situations where like, wait a second, did we invoice actually? And then like operations did everything. And then all of a sudden it didn't get handed over to the finance accounting team and there's a gap. So I think
yeah.
all the way through is important. And then even actually making sure that someone's actually like checking the remittances and making sure that you're getting paid as expected per the invoice, because like, oh, that's where a lot of the chargebacks come in. So that's something that I've seen as well, is that people are surprised and don't realize if operations and finance aren't communicating, and then they end up with a lot of operational or different chargebacks that they weren't aware of that needed to be rectified.
Yep. No, totally, totally get that. It's one of the reasons why I advocate for if you're in the distribution business, use a CRM because
Mhm.
to do all this because there's so many handoffs that happen from the ops to the finance side,
Yeah,
post
there needs to be a
purchase.
yes.
Like it's very easy for individual emails with attachments to get lost in translation along the way, and having a consolidated view of the whole customer life cycle.
Absolutely.
D2C has talked about this for a while, that customer life cycle, but B2B often has not quite figured that out in my
Yeah.
experience. But it's super critical if you like getting paid on time, as it turns out,
Yeah.
which most do. Okay. So one sort of like maybe final kind of scenario here. If you're a distributor who sold field sales,
Mhm.
right? And but I need to add new channels because my buyers are popping up in weird places. Like I want to start listing on Amazon, or I want to start listing in vertical specific marketplaces to my industry, like Chem Direct or something like that. If I'm doing chemicals, how do I add channels without my ops becoming a hot mess? Because we've talked about these sort of individually, and I think we've alluded to some of it. But I'm just super curious, like, how do you do this without burdening your business with having to keep track of like an entire new compliance department and customer service department and sales department for every single channel?
Yeah, that's a great, and I think that that's really important and important to think about from the beginning, because that's exactly what can happen, right? It can like spin out of control, and then every single new channel that's added becomes like a new set of problems. So some of the things that I've seen companies do successfully to navigate this would be one is like actually setting up some type, and I think you'll like this, but setting up some type of like online ordering portal or website. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, I do.
So, a central place where you can send your B2B customers and they can see inventory levels similar to like an e-commerce buying experience, right? So, something that's user friendly that they can use, see what the latest promotions are, and then have a set kind of price list for their login, basically. I've seen that work really well. The other is around centralized product management. So, having a central system for all of your product information. What are your assets? What are your UPCs? What are product dimensions, case packs, all of that information. I've seen a lot of companies struggle to have all of their information centrally if they're not in some type of system. And then things become disparate. People are sharing information that's potentially out of date. So having that all centralized in a digital place is really, really important. I think, similarly, coming back to the first point is around like inventory tracking again, right? So you don't want a customer, if they're trying to place a small wholesale order, to have to check in with a salesperson every single time they want to order something. Right. It's helpful to see, like, is this actually in stock? And so kind of limiting that interaction unless it's absolutely needed. But similar to what you would do from an e-commerce framework, being able to see what is in stock, when it's shipping, and not having to follow up for small information like that. And then CRM is obviously very important as well. So having like that centralized place, like you said before, for customer relationship management. Um, and then from a warehousing perspective, I would say making sure that your warehouse is trained and understands like the different scenarios that you might be sending things out, but then also trying to limit the permutations of that, right? So it's like most customers should be ordering case pack quantities and, so that the customer does or the warehouse doesn't have to open every single pack and pack different things in. It's like, okay, I just have to grab a few boxes, put them on a pallet or send them out. And so just trying to keep your operations for your outbound to these new channels as simple and straightforward as makes sense.
Yeah, I 100% agree with all of that. It's also a lot easier to calculate COGS and project revenue if you have
Right.
case pack quantities, because when you start breaking stuff apart, now you have to get very granular to try to figure out like what did you make on a particular order. So it's easier to track that way. Plus,
Yeah.
you've got extra labor costs associated with that. So
Yeah.
totally agree.
And
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was gonna say, just adding to that, right? It also leaves a lot less room for is there something missing, right? Like when it arrives, like is there an item missing or something like that. So kind of reducing potential errors on the warehousing side, it helps with that too.
Yes, all of that does. Um, well, but there's something else that can be done potentially, maybe I think, to make the distributor's life easier, the brand's life easier. We have manufacturers who listen to this podcast. If you could wave your magic wand and have a manufacturer, supplier, basically, do one thing to make your customers' lives easier, what would it be? They're listening. Now's your chance. They'll do whatever you tell them to. What do
Amazing.
you want?
Just only one
Only
thing. Oh
one.
my okay, wait. Okay, now I have to um this could be done in multiple ways, but clear communication, I think, is one of the most important things. So just having information in a clear place of, how you want to be communicated with, how purchase orders should be received, how things are processed, anything that can be, so communication and I guess standardization, it's another thing that goes into that. But those two things kind of go hand in hand. And I think that that's extremely important. It just makes everyone's lives a lot easier.
Yep. Don't make me pull information out of you. Like, please
Exactly.
proactively provide how you would like to me to buy from you and pay you and what you're selling. I totally get it. So I always ask one, and I know we're coming up on a few minutes left here. I always ask one non-serious question to
Um,
all my guests, which is, what is one piece of media, book, television show, movie, whatever, podcast even, that you've consumed in the last month that stood out to you? It does not have to be business related. I'm not saying
yeah.
I love to read The Economist. I mean, if you love to read The Economist, that's great. But we've had a lot of answers, sci-fi novels, podcasts and stuff. What's one thing that stood out to you that you think
Yeah.
somebody else should see? Or
So I'm actually in the process of reading a book at the moment, and I'm trying to look up the author. I just want to make sure that I get the book. Is it Real Americans or True Americans? Real Americans. So I'm reading a novel at the moment. It's called Real Americans. It's by Rachel Kong. I'm like 300 pages into it, so I'm like 80% done with the book. So I think I can give a recommendation on it because I've made it pretty far along. If it changes drastically in the last 80 pages, I might need to retract this.
okay,
But I really enjoyed it. It follows the story of a family, and it starts off with the perspective of a woman named Lily Chen, and then moves through it, and then switches to her son's perspective like 20 years later,
okay,
and then it
multi-generational.
switches. Yeah, and then it switches to her mother's perspective. So she's from China, and then immigrates to the U.S. Like at some point, and then so it's like showing her life in China, and then like how she kind of like immigrated into the U.S. and just kind of this like multi-generational story of like how their decisions impacted one another, and, I've loved it. I've been a little obsessed with reading
That's
it and have
awesome.
read
Great.
most of it in the last week.
Great answer. I will have to pick that up. My 12-year-old daughter is making her way through some Jane Austen.
Oh, yeah.
And or no, I'm is it? Yeah, she's reading some Jane Austen. I'm reading Jane Eyre, like
Uh-huh.
Bronte, and so that's what I'm stuck with. It's fine. It's good. It's good. It wasn't my first choice. But that's what I'm working on these days. So there's always classics. I always go back to classics. Maybe I'll pick
Oh,
this up
yeah.
after
It's
your
nice to go back to the classics once in a
right.
while. I found myself reading, like, a lot of nonfiction and,
Mhm.
for a couple years, and I'm like, "I wanna get back into fiction," and so this is, the first one that I've read in a while, and I've really enjoyed it.
Well, I hope it's the first of many. Jennifer,
Yes.
it's been great having you on. This has been very educational. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for sharing everything that you know about supply chain with our audience.
Thank you for having me.